in the process of actually writing fiction, the things that you really want to write about sort of come to the surface, and they can almost be embarrassing because...
What story structure do you use personally?
Well, I wanted to say from the outset that I call certain kinds of structures external structures and others internal, and I'll explain what I mean by that. An external structure is something that you start with before writing, and it's going to help guide the storytelling. For example, by page 10, X, Y, and Z has to have been accomplished in the plot. Or by the end of chapter 1, a character has to be developed in a certain way and has to arrive at a certain level of development. Those are what I would call external structures. So the writing is going to, in a way, have to conform to the constraints of the external structure. The way I think about structure and the way I write, teach, and just think about is that structure has certain elements and you can study them, but the first thing to do is write a draft. Back to Flannery O'Connor, this was her idea that, you know, the best way to learn how to write a story is to write a story. We've all, you know, heard them and read them and thought about them. So try to write one to the best of your ability, and then go back and look, what have I done here? Like, what's going on? And if you can have a teacher, that's great. If you can have other readers, that's great. But you can even do it yourself. And so you can ask certain questions about structure that can help you improve your use of structure. For example, time. Time is an element of structure. How is time handled? In the Laurie Moore story that I was referring to, that I read an example from earlier, I believe the story takes place on 5 consecutive days, and then it sort of goes into the foreseeable future. So the first day, one thing happens. The second day, another thing happens. Third day, fourth day, fifth day, and then into the future. You can have a story that takes place all in one day. You can have a story that takes place over a 40-year period. The important thing is it clear when events are taking place, and is the way time is used ordered and presented in a way that best serves the story? And I think these are the kinds of questions that a writer can ask of himself after having written something. I'll give you a couple more examples. Point of view. Point of view is another element of fiction structure. Who is telling us this, right? Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's probably not a first-person story because no first person was back there when God was creating the universe. So that's an omniscient storytelling voice of some kind. But when Mona Simpson says in Lawns, I steal, that's a very different kind of voice. That's like a first-person voice who is in some way confessing, or at least, you know, passing along information about something that she's doing. So is the point of view established quickly and maintained consistently over the course of the writing? With many apprentice fiction writers who are just starting to write and trying to write stories for the first time, they often don't keep the point of view straight. It's sort of, we're in different characters' minds at different times. Sometimes we're getting omniscient information. It gets confusing. So point of view is one. Do I have time for?
Oh, please.
Okay. So another one is scene length and scene numbers. So a question that a writer can ask himself is, were the scenes long enough and developed enough and necessary? A lot of times in an early draft of an apprentice writer's work, or even an experienced writer, there will either be too many scenes or not enough scenes. And sometimes you can only tell that after you write a draft and you see, oh, I didn't ever cover this. Like, of course that needs to be in the story. Or, you know, when you're talking about structure, you're often talking about what needs to go into the story and what needs to stay out. What is the story about and what is it not about? Like, these are the kinds of choices that fiction writers have to make. And some of them you'll make as you're writing a draft, but many of them you'll make after you have a draft in front of you and you're thinking about, okay, how can I make this as good as possible? A huge one for fiction is balance between background and foregrounded story. The foregrounded story is what's going on now. Like, I'm talking to you about fictional structure. Like, that's what's going on now. That's the now of the story that we're currently living. But before this, lots of other things happen that in some way related to the moment that we're having now. So I would call those either background or backstory. Sometimes they even involve flashbacks. So what is the relationship in the short story or a novel between what has happened and what is happening now? There are many writers, like in that Laurie Moore story, FaceTime, there's almost no backstory. All of the backstory is implied by things that the characters say and do. I mean, there might be a minimal amount, but not very much. And Hemingway often is the same way. The Killers, I don't believe there's any backstory. It's all told through dialogue and dramatic action. So I think there certainly needs to be some kind of emphasis on foregrounded story. And this is something that apprentice writers also need to work on and be aware of. Are they showing enough, or are they relying too much on explanation, summary, background? Because these things are much easier to write. Actually, to dramatize a scene takes a lot more work, and so you'll see apprentice writers not doing it. But ultimately, there has to be a really good balance between background and foreground, and usually the emphasis is on foreground. One more that could be mentioned is plot. Plot is a huge subject, but essentially it can be boiled down to what happened, how did it happen, and why did it happen? And somehow the elements of the plot have to be arranged and executed effectively. So something happens, it ramifies, it has consequences, and you go from some opening action or line of dialogue or what have you, and then you start to ask questions about, what happened, how did it happen, and why did it happen, brings us back to motivation. And some motivation is explicitly given by writers and some is not. Iago's motivations in Othello are not always clearly provided by the writer, which was obviously a choice. Othello may have slept with Iago's wife. Certainly Iago was passed over for a promotion and feels slighted, and he feels jealous of Cassio, who hath a daily beauty in his life that makes Iago ugly. So Shakespeare gives us a lot to work with, but ultimately, why does someone behave that badly, that destructively? Some motivations are better left unspecified by the writer.
And I'm hoping we can go back to background and foreground for a moment.
Sure.
And you spoke of in a prior segment a story that you've written that's about a father and son, and that the father is very proud of one aspect of the son,
Right.
but maybe not so much the other, and maybe it has more to do with the father and what he wanted for his son, and
Right.
it wasn't maybe the same, beer drinking, football watching. I don't know. I'm just assuming.
Right.
So with the background and the foreground, how would you put this in the story?
Well, I like to do both at the same time. Like, I like to give, both what's going on now and make sure that that's clear, but then also start reaching back to, like, how did things get to be the way they are now? And in that story, the son has already done something problematic. And so the foregrounded story is already on the table, which I almost always work that way. Like, I rarely give a bunch of background before I've indicated what the foregrounded story is. I just myself am much more compelled by a dramatized scene than I am from background information, although background information can be critical and wonderful to write. But yeah, I usually have a problem underway. I mean, you have that old Greek term in medias res, like in the middle of things, and that the Greeks sort of thought it was a good idea when telling a story to, rather than go back to the very beginning of something, to just pick it up in the middle of things. And that's how it's done in that story, and that's how it's done. I would say that's generally how I work.
Are parts of the background seeping into the foreground story, like, you never wanted my picture up the way, you did with, Brother Bobby. I realize you're not going to say it that way, but
Right. Yeah.
Is it seeping in? Little clues are coming in.
That's my favorite. My favorite way to write a story in general. I mean, I'm not like saying it's the best way, but there are many ways to tell a good story. I mean, an infinite number. But like, if you can sort of weave in the backstory, like, maybe give a paragraph here or like a few lines of dialogue that happened earlier there, and not sort of like pause the entire foregrounded story and say, okay, reader, now we're going to take a lengthy break to talk about like what happened earlier in your childhood. I like, if possible, I like to try to bring that backstory in to the telling of the main story. And often, that can happen with dialogue where people refer to what happened in the past. And that's a way of preventing having to just take a big break and go back. Like, if you have a character say, well, but you did X, and that brings the past in without having to stop the action to deal with the past, if that makes sense. I just wanted to add to something I said earlier. I was saying that I often like to sort of weave in things that have happened in the past into what's happening now, rather than sort of taking a big break, going into the past, and then returning to the present. But having said that, that is something that I often like to do. I don't always work that way. I was thinking of something that I had written in which, during the first page or two, it was a first-person narrator, and he referred to a woman as the only woman he had ever loved. And when I first wrote that, I thought, well, it might be interesting to never sort of specify her or never show, how he knew her, or maybe just sort of keep it as this sort of this figure who he can't even bear to remember because it pains him so much. So instead of dealing with that pain, he just sort of thinks of her in these terms, the only woman I've ever loved. But as is often the case with me, and I think with other writers too, like, if you put something into a story, you have to deal with it. Like, to to put something in there like that and then just to leave it as a unspecified component of the story, I don't think a reader's going to accept that. And if I were the reader, I don't know that I would accept that. So I ended up figuring out who the woman was that he had loved, and I ended up writing 25 or 30, this was a longer piece, 25 or 30 pages about the time that they spent together. So I'm just saying that there are many, many ways to write a story, and you find structurally the way that you think will serve the best interest of the story. And one other thing I also wanted to add is something that I got from a Deborah Eisenberg interview, in which she said something very interesting. When you sit down to write fiction, you might think that you want to write about X. But in the process of actually writing fiction, the things that you really want to write about sort of come to the surface, and they can almost be embarrassing because you have this idea that, oh yeah, I'm going to write a story about X. And like you think that it's sort of this controlled idea that, and this happens to people who write with sort of external plots. And so they write about that because that's what they plan to write about. And what she was saying is, like, if you're sort of receptive to what you actually want to be writing about, it might be quite different than what you think or plan to write about. And that has been a helpful observation to me.